Thank you for that introduction. I'd like to thank the program organizers who invited me to talk today. My name is Janice Brown, and I'm the branch chief in the Office of Policy in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. Pharmaceutical quality. A quality product of any kind consistently meets the expectations of the user. Drugs are no different. Patients expect safe and effective medicine with every dose they take. Pharmaceutical quality is assuring every dose is safe and effective, free of contamination and defects. It's what gives patients confidence in their next dose of medicine. Today, I'll be talking about product quality questions submitted in control correspondences in the Office of Pharmaceutical Quality. An overview of my presentation includes a description of the control correspondence process and OPQ, an analysis of quality questions that we typically see in controls, examples of frequently asked questions, issues that we've identified in some submissions, and an overview of OPQ's continual improvement process. So all incoming controls are triaged by the Office of Generic Drugs, and the product quality questions are sent to OPQ. Once we receive them, we assign a review team, develop a written response to the question, and send a response to the inquirer. We are also responsible for ensuring that controls and clarification requests meet the GDUFA goal date. OPQ performs an analysis of the controls by collecting metrics on the types of questions that are submitted. We sort incoming controls into topic-specific categories, and currently we use about 50 different categories. For each category, we analyze the type of questions, and I'll talk about some of these categories and subcategories in my next slide. OPQ periodically analyzes metrics in order to stay ahead and identify upcoming trends in the types of questions that are submitted. We have an active continual improvement process to evaluate our policies and policy documents as they relate to control correspondence. This slide is an overview of the total number of controls that OPQ has responded to since 2016. Broken down by year, we've seen a pretty steady increase in the number of controls that have been received. Since 2006, we've seen slightly over 110% increase in the number of submissions received by our office. So OPQ has a process for collecting metrics. All incoming controls are grouped into categories and subcategories. There are 5 different broad categories that we use to group the controls. These include drug product, drug substance, facility, manufacturing, and post-approval. As shown in this slide, you can see the majority of the questions relate to the drug product. Included in this slide are the top 10 topics based upon the number of controls that we've received in 2020. We've noticed that over the years that the number of questions are really clustered into certain topics. The first cluster includes questions related to container closure, batch size, and bracketing and matrixing approaches, and these represent the top 3 in terms of the number of questions. The second cluster is questions about packaging, storage orientation of stability samples, and the amount of data needed for the primary batches. The last cluster are questions on size and shape of solid oral dosage forms, dissolution, and the amount of API overage that would be allowed for a drug product. Recently, since 2019, we've seen an increase in the number of questions related to the endotoxin limits, and I'll talk about this later in my slide presentation. Some examples of questions about batch size. By far, the most number of questions request confirmation of the guidance recommendations for a reduced batch size. These include the reference listed drug has orphan drug designation, the drug product uses a controlled drug substance, and the ANDA submission batches are the same as the commercial batch size. So we understand that applicants want confirmation for the smaller batch size so their application doesn't get RTR'd, but it's really not necessary to have a control response to support a reduced batch size if it's already included in the current guidance recommendation. You can just include a justification by referencing the guidance in the ANDA submission. Just a reminder to check that you're referencing the most current guidance, since some of the recommendations change as the guidances are updated. Examples of questions regarding container closure changes. We typically see ampule to vials, vials to prefilled syringes, which represents the highest category as far as numbers of controls that are submitted, and different vial sizes from the RLD. We also see questions about compositional changes, like changes from a glass to a plastic vial or a bottle to a sachet. So in general, different container closures from the RLD are acceptable, but keep in mind that for drug device combination, analysis of the user interface should be performed. I've included a reference here that should be carefully reviewed, especially about the threshold analysis of a device. Some examples of questions about bracketing and matrixing. Bracketing of dose-similar formulations may be acceptable with comparable stability data from clinical or developmental batches. There are some exceptions to this, especially for high-risk drug products that are prone to degradation that have known stability issues. And high-risk products include highly potent drug products and the ones that actually have a low drug load. In these cases, we recommend that you carefully evaluate whether a bracketing approach should be considered. Different strengths of solid oral dosage forms or different fill volumes for liquids manufactured from common blends are generally acceptable, and we recommend that you follow the recommendations in ICH Q1D for bracketing and matrixing approaches. Some issues that we have seen with controls that lead to responses where where it's not entirely clear. These are generally due to not having enough background information, and examples of this include not providing dimensions and volume determinations for the RLD and the test product for questions about size and shape of tablets or capsules, the adequacy of a reduced batch size for ANDA submission batch without any information provided on the proposed commercial batch size, and information on the container closure and whether a batch is manufactured using a common blend for bracketing different fill volumes. So issues with controls due to a lack of clarity. Sometimes the questions are phrased so it's very difficult to understand. We do our best to understand the question, but in some cases our responses maybe aren't as clear as they could be, just simply because we misinterpreted what the question was being asked. Other issues include not providing necessary product information, which is needed to answer the question. For example, whether the formulation is Q1, Q2 with the RLD. Some submissions actually include too much information. For example, lengthy and detailed information, which can be hundreds of pages at times. And in these cases, we consider the information that was submitted, but the data is just simply not extensively reviewed. Just a reminder that it's really not appropriate to include detailed study reports in a control. Some questions are just too general. For example, the FDA can't respond to whether the product development approach is acceptable. We recommend that you focus on a development-specific issue instead. Some post-approval questions are challenging because the questions are too general, and at times basic information is not provided. For example, what the specific dosage form. Examples of questions that can't be answered in a control include issues related to the acceptability of an acceptance criteria in a specification, the adequacy of an in-process control, or recommendations to a proposed study plan, such as like an impurity clearance approach or adequacy of a characterization study. The acceptability of an API overage in a final drug product. We generally provide a response to these questions. However, the final determination of whether the overage is acceptable will be determined during the review of your application, since it's dependent upon your demonstration of manufacturing losses. Other general recommendations include to separate questions for multiple disciplines and submit them as separate controls. Develop a concise question and include the appropriate supporting information. At times, we receive a lot of peripheral supporting information that isn't really directly related to the question. And again, resolve the Q1, Q2 formulation issues before sending a control to OPQ, especially if there's a bracketing or matrixing question. If you have a question related to the response, we suggest that you request a clarification within 7 days, and this will help promote your generic drug development. You won't have to submit a separate control and wait through the cycle in order to get a new response. Lastly, verify information submitted in the control. Right before you submit it, verify that there's no changes to the RLD in the Orange Book, or a new draft or final guidance that's referenced hasn't been published, that you want to reference the most current information in the guidance. So we are actively implementing advancement in control responses. We have restructured the response to indicate whether the proposal is acceptable, whether it's not acceptable, or provisional early in the FDA response. So if the firm's proposal is not acceptable as is, but there is a condition that might make it proposal, we add a provisional clause. For example, quote, your proposal may be considered acceptable provided that you submit, X information in your ANDA submission. Historically, if the proposal is not acceptable, we have always included some reason for that. OPQ responses are cleared by relevant sub-office senior leaders to ensure that the response is in line with the current process and it is clear and understandable. So I'm going to pivot a little bit and talk about how OPQ policy uses the questions submitted in a control. We use metrics that we collect on the control questions to evaluate our policy effectiveness and relevance. We actively track the types of questions submitted in each category and address them through our ongoing policy development with a goal to implement continual improvements in our policies and our policy documents. We analyze the types and numbers of questions submitted to determine the best strategy to address them. We determine if there's a lack of clarity in a guidance where a revision should be considered, or is there a policy gap where a new guidance on a specific topic is needed? So this slide outlines some of our policy activities in OPQ. We are revising the ANDA Q&A guidance for stability testing of drug substances and drug product. This revision is to clarify and update our policy, since this guidance is frequently the subject of many control questions. We are also developing a new guidance titled Quality and Stability Testing of Drug Substances and Drug Products for NDAs, ANDAs, and BLAs, and associated labeling statements for drug products. This includes our current thinking on topics such as stability testing and labeling recommendation, and to address some frequently asked questions where there is no guidance on that specific topic. Where possible, OPQ has harmonized the recommendations between application types in the guidance, and some recommendations are not harmonized. For example, the amount of stability data needed for an application. For an ANDA, you would continue to use 6 months of long-term and 6 months of accelerated data versus 12 months of long-term and 6 months of accelerated data for an NDA. As described earlier in my slide presentation, due to the increased number of microbiology questions related to endotoxin, the OPQ compendial operations staff is engaging with the USP to discuss FDA recommendation to remove endotoxin limits from individual USP monograms. So, in conclusion, our goal is to respond to controls submitted so our expectations are transparent, and we strive to ensure that OPQ policies are clear, transparent, and intuitive to all of you. So with that, I've got 2 challenge questions. The first question is, what type of question can be answered in a control correspondence? The adequacy of an impurity clearance approach, the adequacy of a product characterization study, the specific question on generic drug development, or all of the above. And please enter your answer into the Q&A pod. Okay, the correct answer is number 3, a specific question on generic drug development. So the challenge question number 2 is, what are the characteristics of a good controlled correspondence submission? 1, submitting a concise question that can be answered by a single discipline. 2, include appropriate supporting information. 3, not verifying that there were no changes to the RLD in the Orange Book, or number 4, number 1, and number 2. So if you can please enter your answer into the Q&A pod. Okay, the correct answer is number 4, number 1 and 2. So with that, that concludes my presentation.